I was just going through some news this morning and I ran across a story that I thought was fairly interesting. A story about Eric Holder, the former attorney general underneath President Obama. And there was a story about how he believed that America could strike a deal with the former NSA contractor Edward Snowden in order to have him return from exile back to the United States. This, of course, has been a big debate. Opponents of what Snowden did have urged him to come back and face the music, while those sympathetic to Snowden's plight have said, well, if he does, he won't receive a fair trial. So this was an interesting thing. Eric Holder claiming, now he's already out of office. He's the former attorney general. But now he's saying that America could strike a deal with Edward Snowden. And I thought this to be somewhat of a bizarre headline, considering especially that he's already left office, as I stated. And so I dug a little deeper and I found out that Eric Holder just returned as a hero, as The Intercept has called it, to the law firm that he was at right before he was brought on board as Attorney General by President Obama in February of 2009. And what's so interesting about this particular law firm that Eric Holder has gone back to, whose name is Covington and Burling, is the fact that this corporate law firm has a wonderful reputation on Wall Street for defending the interests of the big banks. The Covington and Burling client list has included 4 of the largest banks in America, including Bank of America, Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase, and Wells Fargo. And all of this is very revealing when you consider the fact that during his tenure as Attorney General, Eric Holder failed to criminally prosecute any of the financial firms that were responsible for the market collapse in 2008. Just another example of crony capitalism that has destroyed America's economy. Friends, I've got to tell you, I think it's time for America to break up the big banks. I am no friend of the banks. I am no friend of the corporations. In fact, I think it's time to restore Glass-Steagall. The biggest U.S. banks are preparing for the anti-Wall Street sentiments that are inevitably going to grow out of the upcoming 2016 presidential debates. I don't know if you've been watching. We've been talking about it on this broadcast quite a bit about Bernie Sanders and how, and now you're seeing it on the news, although you're not getting a lot of detail about Bernie Sanders, you are seeing the crowds. They are at least talking about that in the mainstream press. He is turning out larger crowds than anyone. In fact, when he went to Iowa, he had the largest crowd out of all of the presidential candidates. In Wisconsin, which is notoriously a pro-union state and obviously would like Bernie Sanders, he had over 10,000 people in attendance. I mean, this guy is becoming a rock star of the 2016 presidential election cycle. And people like him and people like Elizabeth Warren, who's also a senator, scare the living daylights out of the big banks because they realize what people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are saying is they're calling for the heads of these big banks. Remember, no one has been prosecuted for what's happened, even though all kinds of wrongdoing has been admitted, even though the American people were fleeced like sheep and sheared like sheep in 2008. No one was held responsible. We continually see big banks laundering drug money for international drug cartels and even providing terrorist financing for our enemies. And yet nobody goes to jail. And the way I view it is that if these banks are too big to fail and they're too big to jail, then they're just too big to exist. The banks now today are 30 to 40% larger than they were prior to the 2008 economic collapse. So we kept hearing about, well, these banks are too big, we have to bail them out, they're too big to fail. And then what's the solution? You just make them bigger after the crash. Now they're bigger. So Senator Bernie Sanders, for example, has already introduced legislation that would break up the big banks, thus ending Wall Street's too big to fail problem. Another Democratic candidate, Martin O'Malley, is calling for the restoration of Glass-Steagall, which was the legislative response to the 1930s depression that prevented investment banks from colluding with commercial banks and participating in commercial activities. In essence, there was a Chinese wall placed in between investment banking, which served the investment class, and commercial banking, which served, the average working person. And this prevented the investment banks from being able to dip into the deposits of the working class members of a community and use that money to gamble on Wall Street or on whatever, their derivatives or whatever they're choosing to gamble on that particular week. But the Glass-Steagall Act, which served as this nice Chinese wall dividing these two segments of the banking system, was repealed in 1999 underneath then President Bill Clinton. It only took 8 years for the banksters to completely demolish the U.S. economy once again after it was repealed. The big banks also enjoy an unfair advantage through their proprietary trading, which allows them to front-run the market. You might have seen some of these details put out. There was a book put out called Flash Boys that gave us a pretty interesting view on this high-frequency trading and how these large, big investment banks are manipulating the overall marketplaces for their gain. And, of course, it ends up costing you and me, money in the long run. Unfortunately for Main Street, the big banks on Wall Street serve a purpose to Washington in maintaining liquidity in the government's debt markets. And so there's a nice coziness that exists between Wall Street and Washington. We all know this. But in order to understand the depths of the corruption that permeates Washington and Wall Street, you really have to understand what cronyism is. And that's exactly what I'm talking about when I brought up Eric Holder and his role at Covington and Burling. You see, cronyism simply refers to the practice of showing partiality in appointing friends and other associates to positions of power without considering their qualifications. In government, this might take the form of a political leader who appoints friends or those he feels will support or at least not prevent his own agenda. And he will appoint those friends to positions of power within Washington. And what makes such an arrangement cronyism is not the promotion of a friend per se, but the lack of regard for the friend's credentials and qualifications. If you've ever heard of the phrase a good old boys club or a good old boys system, then you can fully understand what cronyism is. Therefore, crony capitalism is simply a system in which corporate leaders and government leaders show favoritism towards each other. Crony capitalism leads to government grants and tax breaks for corporate leaders. Meanwhile, those corporate leaders provide campaign contributions and other soft money favors to lawmakers. And now, thanks to the egregious Supreme Court ruling known as the Citizens United case, corporations are now allowed to place unlimited amounts of money into every single election cycle, and they can do so anonymously. This is one of the worst Supreme Court rulings ever in memory. Not the worst by any stretch of the imagination. We can think of worse ones. But this is among the worst Supreme Court rulings. In essence, solidifying the idea that corporations are persons and that their personhood must be protected and that their money is a form of free speech. And this, of course, has unintended consequences because the money is what we call dark money, because corporations could put money into any particular candidacy through super PACs or through other types of organizations, and they can do so anonymously. This now gives tremendous amounts of power to foreign governments, foreign entities who want to influence the presidency and the presidential election cycle here in America. All right, so let's break this down to an example. Let's say that in China, the Chinese leaders, the Chinese government, wants to influence the 2016 presidential election. Can they? Thanks to Citizens United, not only can they can put unlimited amounts of money into our election cycle, and they can do so anonymously through shell companies, and that dark money can flow into particular, super PACs or whatever the case might be, organizations that raise money for these candidates. And so if they have a particular leader that they want to put in office, that they want to, persuade and they want to attempt to influence the election, thanks to Citizens United, they can. Friends, our system is broken. Crony capitalism is a corrupt system that socialists claim is the inevitable outcome of pure, unadulterated capitalism. This is what Karl Marx was talking about whenever he condemned capitalism. Of course, he was wrong on many fronts, and especially wrong on many of his predictions, the timing especially. But he claimed that capitalism could not continue to be pure, but in fact, it would be hijacked by the rich and turned against the working people. Now, if you're a capitalist, of course, you blame the government's excessive role in the economy for requiring close ties between Washington and corporate interests. So crony capitalism explains why Eric Holder, after moving from the corporate law firm known for serving Wall Street clients, Covington and Burling, goes to Washington in February of 2009, holds none of the banks that were his former clients accountable for the 2008 crash, despite gargantuan evidence against them. And then upon his departure from Washington, finds a corner office waiting for him with his name on the door at Covington and Burling. It's what we refer to as the revolving door between the government sector and the private sector. And I believe that the candidate who speaks most directly to this problem in 2016 will certainly not have the support of the corporations, will certainly not have the support of the mainstream corporate-controlled press, but they will have the support of growing numbers of American citizens who feel disenfranchised by crony capitalism and its effects.